Picture Michael Jackson, not with Quincy Jones in 1982, but stepping into that world a decade later. Thriller is no longer a sleek, disco-infused pop masterpiece. It's a gritty, street-smart monster of a record, driven by punchy 808 drums, neon-lit synth pads, and guest verses from rap's rising stars. The Vincent Price monologue, swapped for a shadowy rap cameo. The zombie dance, reimagined with baggy pants, high-top fades, and warehouse strobe lights. This isn't just a time shift, it's a complete reinvention. And the sound? It would have shocked everyone. The heartbeat of Thriller in 1982 was the Lindrum, crisp, tight, and funky. It gave the track a polished precision that fit right in with early 80s pop. But if Michael had waited until 1992, that same beat would have felt ancient. The music world had shifted. Drum programming had become heavier, deeper, and more physical. Imagine the first seconds of Thriller not opening with that familiar tick-tick groove, but with a thick, chest-thumping 808 bass kick so deep it shakes your rib cage. Over that, a razor-sharp snare cracks like a whip, drenched in gated reverb, each hit echoing just long enough to make it feel cinematic. The tempo would still be danceable, but the rhythm would swing harder, borrowing from the bounce of New Jack Swing and the hypnotic pull of hip-hop's golden age. The hi-hats, no longer steady and polite. Now they'd stutter and skip, programmed with MPC swing, giving every bar that head nod urgency. Instead of the clean pop percussion from the original, you'd get layered textures, muted conga slaps tucked under the kick, metallic shakers dancing in the background, and maybe even sampled footsteps or chain rattles, subtly hinting at the track's sinister theme. And the bass line? In 82, it was funky and melodic. In 92, it would go lower, dirtier, an earth-rumbling sub-bass that you'd feel in your stomach more than hear in your ears. Producers like Teddy Riley had mastered the art of combining that low-end power with crisp, top-end percussion, and Michael's ear for rhythm would have pushed it even further. The result wouldn't just make you want to dance, it would make you move differently. Instead of the sharp, choreographed steps of the original Thriller, this version's groove would demand looser, grittier moves, part club floor, part street cipher. It would be a beat built not for pristine hi-fi listening rooms, but for echoing through boomboxes, nightclubs, and late-night radio dripping with attitude. This shift alone would completely transform Thriller's DNA. The heartbeat of the song would go from polished pop perfection to raw urban swagger. But a killer beat is just the foundation, and the real magic happens when you hand it to the right producer. In 1982, Thriller was shaped by the flawless touch of Quincy Jones, a producer with jazz sophistication, pop instincts, and an unmatched ability to blend styles into something timeless. But in 1992, Quincy's glossy 80s sheen would have been out of step with the harder, more street-driven sound ruling the charts. If Thriller had been born a decade later, the biggest question would be, who would Michael trust with the crown? The obvious first choice? Teddy Riley. By 92, Teddy was the undisputed king of New Jack Swing. He was already working with Michael on Dangerous, crafting tracks like Remember the Time that fused R&B smoothness with hip-hop grit. In a 92 Thriller, Teddy's fingerprints would be all over it. Tight, syncopated drum programming, sharp horn stabs that hit like punches, and a groove so infectious you couldn't stand still. He had a way of making beats feel both luxurious and raw, like silk draped over steel. But imagine if Michael had taken a risk and called Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis instead. Coming off their success with Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation 1814, they knew how to build cinematic, socially charged pop without losing the dance floor. Their version of Thriller might have leaned more atmospheric, cold, glassy synths shimmering over deep, restrained bass lines, with each track carrying a subtle sense of menace. Jam and Lewis also had a knack for layering harmonies until they sounded like a choir trapped inside a neon dream, perfect for reimagining Thriller's haunting choruses. And then there's the wild card, Dr. Dre. It sounds wild, but by 1992, Dre had just dropped The Chronic, and his beats were defining the West Coast sound. Massive, rolling bass, tight snares, and laid-back funk samples that hit with hypnotic precision. A Dre-produced Thriller could have traded the disco-inspired pulse for a slow-burning G-funk swagger. Picture Michael's vocals floating over Parliament funkadelic samples, with eerie synth whines and deep bass rumble replacing the original stabbing horror chords. The Vincent Price bridge? Maybe Dre swaps it for a shadowy rap verse from a young Snoop Dogg, dripping with charisma and danger. Each producer choice changes the album's entire DNA. Teddy Riley's version would be high energy, club-ready, and full of flashy production tricks. Jammin' Lewis would turn it into a moody, layered masterpiece with a futuristic edge. Dr. Dre? He'd strip it down, make it dangerous, and give Thriller a slow, smoldering confidence. In 1982, Quincy Jones built a pop juggernaut that could conquer every radio station in the world. In 1992, Michael could have built something more niche, but potentially just as world-shaking. An album that not only dominated MTV, but also blasted from lowriders, block parties, and underground clubs. But even the greatest producer can only work with the tools of the time, and in '92, those tools sounded very different from 1982. One of the most iconic parts of the original Thriller was that eerie, stabbing synth riff that creeps in like a horror movie soundtrack. In 1982, it was futuristic, almost alien. But a decade later, synthesizer technology had exploded, and the sound of pop had shifted from sharp analog edges to lush digital landscapes. In a 1992 Thriller, those cold, staccato synth hits might be replaced with sweeping pads from a Korg wave station, a keyboard that could morph and evolve sounds in real time. Instead of a single sustained note, you'd hear layers of shifting textures, glassy highs, rumbling lows, and a subtle shimmer that made the whole thing feel alive, as if the music itself was breathing. For the eerie horror moments, a Yamaha SY-77 could supply digital bell tones and haunting ambient swells, the kind that feel like they're floating in a dark alleyway. And if Michael wanted grit, a Roland JD800 could spit out growling, distorted synth leads that cut through the mix like a knife. The bass line would also evolve. In '82, it was funky and melodic, but in '92, it might be replaced by deep sub-bass programmed on an MPC 60, tuned so low it would shake the trunk of any car blasting it down the street. Instead of riding on top of the groove, the bass would become the groove, something you feel in your chest before you even notice it's there. Even the piano elements would change. Quincy's version had clean, tightly mic'd keys. The '92 version? They'd be gated and drenched in Lexicon 480L reverb, creating that dramatic echoing hit you hear on early '90s ballads and club tracks. Each chord would feel like it was bouncing around an empty warehouse before vanishing into the shadows. Michael was always an innovator when it came to sound effects, and in this alternate timeline, that creativity would lean into the urban cinematic. Imagine the creak of a subway train, the clink of a bottle in an alley, a dog barking in the distance, all chopped up, sampled, and woven into the beat so subtly that you don't notice them until the third or fourth listen. Instead of just Halloween-style spookiness, this Thriller would sound like a late-night walk through a dangerous part of the city, equal parts seductive and unsettling. And of course, those legendary transition moments, the way Thriller shifts from verse to chorus, would be beefed up with DJ-style scratches, filter sweeps, and reversed cymbal swells pulling directly from the hip-hop toolkit of the era. It wouldn't be about clean pop segues, more about throwing the listener off balance, making each shift feel like the floor just dropped out beneath them. This wasn't just about upgrading the sound, it was about changing the language of the music. The Thriller of 1992 wouldn't be speaking the smooth, radio-friendly dialect of '82. It would be speaking the raw, unpredictable slang of the streets. And once that sonic backbone was in place, Michael would have the perfect canvas for his most powerful instrument of all, his voice.
By 1992, Michael's voice had evolved. The smooth, almost boyish tone of Thriller-era MJ had given way to a sharper, more aggressive delivery, the kind you hear on Dangerous. His ad-libs were more explosive, his phrasing more percussive, and he wasn't afraid to growl, gasp, or shout to cut through dense production. In a '92 Thriller, that vocal power would be front and center. The verses wouldn't just be sung, they'd bounce with the groove, riding the swing of the beat like an extra drum pattern. Michael's breaths would be part of the rhythm, every he and cha punctuating the track. In the choruses, his voice would be doubled and tripled, layered until it felt like a wall of sound, each harmony sitting at a slightly different pitch, creating a massive, almost gospel-like swell. And speaking of gospel, the backing vocals would go far beyond the original. Picture a full choir arranged in tight, syncopated hits, answering Michael's lines like a call-and-response preacher service. Producers like Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis had mastered the art of making harmonies sound both heavenly and urgent, and that influence would seep into Thriller. It would make the hook not just catchy but commanding, a chant that demanded you sing along whether you wanted to or not. Then there's the bridge, the most iconic spoken word moment in pop history. In '82, Vincent Price's theatrical monologue turned the song into a Halloween legend. But in 1992, the choice might have been different. Maybe Price's voice would still appear, but chopped into haunting samples that echoed in the background like a ghost in the machine. Or maybe Michael would take a risk and hand that section to a rapper. Imagine a young Snoop Dogg, LL Cool J, or Busta Rhymes delivering a low, menacing verse over a stripped-down beat punctuated by eerie synth swells and sudden bass drops. It would feel like a cipher in a haunted alleyway, blending hip-hop swagger with cinematic tension. Michael's own vocal improvisations would also get bolder. Instead of just ad-libbing at the end, he might vamp over the beat for a full extra minute, weaving in spoken lines, scatting melodies, and playful threats, turning the outro into a jam session that DJs could loop for the dance floor. And because this was the early 1990s, vocal effects would be a key part of the arrangement. The Eventide H3000 harmonizer could give certain lines a metallic, otherworldly shimmer. A subtle pitch shift on select ad-libs could make them sound like they were coming from another dimension. And for the creepiest moments, Michael's voice might be run through distortion or reversed entirely, so you only catch the words when your brain unscrambles them a beat later. This reimagined Thriller wouldn't just be a song, it would be a performance, a masterclass in how to use the human voice as both an instrument and a character. It would pull you in, keep you guessing, and make you feel like Michael was right there in the room, whispering and shouting into your ear. But the sound of a '92 Thriller isn't just in the music, it's in the world built around it. And that world would look nothing like 1982. The original Thriller video in 1983 was a cultural earthquake, a mini horror film with choreographed zombies, cinematic lighting, and a playful, campy tone. But by 1992, music videos had transformed. MTV was louder, darker, more urban. The budgets were huge, but the gloss was traded for grit. If Thriller had been born in this era, its visuals would have been just as legendary, but the world it lived in would have been completely different. Forget the red leather jacket under moonlight. Picture Michael in oversized streetwear with bold 90s patterns, a leather vest over a turtleneck, gold chains glinting under flickering neon signs. The setting wouldn't be a foggy graveyard, it would be an abandoned warehouse in the heart of the city, with graffiti-covered walls, broken windows, and shafts of dusty light cutting through the darkness. The opening scene might start not with a cheesy B-movie skit, but with a cinematic tracking shot down a wet alleyway, steam rising from manhole covers, the faint sound of a police siren in the distance. Instead of a date night setup, maybe Michael's character is wandering into dangerous territory, drawn to a place he shouldn't be. The monsters here aren't traditional zombies, they're street dance crews, moving in unison with sharp, bone-snapping choreography that feels part horror movie, part battle circle. The lighting would be pure early 1990s MTV, hard shadows, strobe bursts, flashes of green and purple gels, making every frame feel like a music video and a crime thriller rolled into one. Quick cuts between dancers' feet, close-ups of tense eyes, and slow-motion spins would give it a sense of urgency, like you're watching something forbidden. And the Vincent Price moment, or its rap verse replacement, would be a visual turning point. If it's a rap cameo, maybe the MC appears in a pool of light, delivering his lines while dancers creep in from the shadows behind him. If it's chopped up Price samples, they could be synced with rapid flashes of disturbing imagery, shadowy figures in masks, flickers of Michael's eyes glowing in the dark, brief glimpses of something monstrous moving just out of frame. Dance was evolving fast in 1992, and Michael would have pulled in the best. Think pop and lock specialists, b-boy crews, and even Crump's earliest prototypes. The choreography wouldn't be less about symmetry, more about impact. Moves hitting hard on every bass drop, sudden freezes, explosive spins, and fluid slides across the floor. Even the ending would change. In '83, Michael turns to the camera with those infamous yellow eyes. In 1992, the final shot might be Michael fading into the crowd of dancers, swallowed by the beat, the camera pulling back into the chaos of the warehouse as the music echoes into silence. No wink, no joke, just a haunting fade to black that leaves you unsettled. This version of Thriller wouldn't just be a music video. It would be an urban legend in VHS form, passed from friend to friend, rewound 100 times to catch every detail. It would feel like something you shouldn't be watching alone at night, and yet you couldn't look away. But beyond the sound and the visuals, there's one more thing a 1992 Thriller would have needed to truly work: its cultural impact. And in that alternate history, the ripple effect would be massive. When Thriller hit in 1982, it didn't just dominate the charts, it rewrote them. It broke racial barriers on MTV, turned music videos into cultural events, and set a commercial standard no one has matched since. But if Michael had dropped it in 1992, the ripple effect would have been wildly different, and in some ways, even more explosive. By the early 1990s, hip-hop was no longer underground. It was taking over mainstream radio. R&B was evolving fast, New Jack Swing was at its peak, and pop was learning to live with harder edges. A Thriller shaped by Teddy Riley, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, or even Dr. Dre, could have been the perfect bridge between worlds, bringing pop audiences into hip-hop's groove and hip-hop heads into Michael's orbit. This wouldn't have just been a pop album, it would have been a genre fusion blueprint. A record that showed major labels you could blend street beats, rap cameos, and soulful melodies without losing mass appeal. Artists like Janet Jackson, Bobby Brown, and Boyz II Men were already proving the formula on a smaller scale, but with Michael's global reach, it could have gone nuclear. It also would have shifted how people viewed Michael himself. In '82, he was the world's biggest pop star, polished and untouchable. In '92, with a street-infused Thriller, he'd look more like a cultural chameleon, someone who could stand alongside the hardest rappers, the smoothest R&B singers, and the most cutting-edge producers without losing his identity. It would have expanded his image beyond pop icon into urban legend, the kind of artist who could dominate both MTV and BET without compromise. And the live shows. Imagine the Dangerous World Tour infused with this new Thriller. The 808s rumbling through stadium floors, the rap bridge dropping into a dance break that blends b-boy moves with MJ's precision. Fans in bucket hats and baggy jeans moonwalking next to leather-clad dancers. It would have been the concert event of the decade. Even the album's influence would be different. In our reality, Thriller inspired a generation of pop acts to aim for big hooks and bigger budgets. In this alternate timeline, it might have inspired them to think dirtier, groovier, and more experimental. The early 2000s fusion of pop and hip-hop, from Justin Timberlake to Beyoncé, might have happened a decade earlier. Of course, there's a flip side. A darker, grittier Thriller might not have been as universally beloved as the '82 version. Some pop fans might have found it too aggressive, too urban, but that's also what would make it legendary. An album that didn't just unite audiences, but challenged them.
In short, a 1992 Thriller could have been less about breaking records and more about changing the rules, a seismic cultural moment that pulled the music industry toward the streets without losing its cinematic magic. And when all the beats faded, all the videos aired, and all the debates were over, one question would still remain. A 1992 Thriller would have been darker, heavier, and far more dangerous, an urban masterpiece instead of a polished pop phenomenon. It might not have broken the same records, but it could have changed the direction of music a decade earlier. The only real mystery is, would the world have been ready for it?